Now, you proposed in the Financial Times QE for the people. Tell us about it. What is QE for the people?
Well, QE for the people is not QE for the banks, which is the first thing I've got to get straight. Because what the banks have been, what's been done with the modern QE is the central bank's been buying off the private banks, giving them cash in return for bonds, etc., which has inflated their free cash supply, and that's a huge part of where asset price bubbles have come from. But the only way that money's turned up in the real economy is when they go and buy the occasional Lamborghini, and the person who washes the car gets a certain amount of income from it. So the money's gone, as Michael Hudson put it beautifully, the helicopter's flown over Wall Street, not over Main Street.
So what would QE for the people, what would the UK look like right now, today, if they had taken that £375 billion and given it to the people? How would the mechanism work according to your plan, and what would it look differently to today?
I've got a slight variation on the simple QE I'm saying, which actually use it to cancel a large part of the private debt in the public, that's stopping the public being able to invest, innovate, spend in general. So I'd be giving money in an equal sense to all households, so you'd be distributing that money throughout the economy. But if anybody who received it had debt, they would have to pay the debt down. And you'd use that to cancel part of the private debt that's actually encumbering society right now. On the other hand, if you weren't in debt, you would get a spending boost. So what you'd have is that 375 billion would have been a straight stimulus to the British economy, rather than being this totally indirect stimulus through the financial sector, which is supposed to work through the wealth effect. And when they do their research, there is no particular wealth effect. The main wealth effect comes out of housing, which is why we've seen the economy here growing, because of the housing bubble. The government's also been pumping up. But QE for the banks has been effectively useless in stimulating demand and reducing the private debt burden on the economy. This would be a direct way of stimulating demand and getting rid of the debt burden.
Okay, now if that were to take place, the problem is that the banks who took the money would have gone bankrupt. And so the banks argued to the government that if we go bankrupt without this money, that we're going to take the entire economy down with us, and they essentially threatened the government in a lot of ways. So talk a little bit about that. Is that true? And if it's true, does it really matter? And how do you take care of that?
Well, this is one of the big dilemmas, that the banking sector does two things. It enables us to do transactions, and that's a huge part of keeping the economy functioning. It also injects new money into the economy. And what it should be doing is injecting that new money in ways that finance innovation, which we're finding being done in the internet world, in the Bitcoin world, in all the innovation.
Yeah, because they created their own money with those crypto. So that's why you're seeing the innovation.
The only way in which monetary innovation and monetary systems supporting innovation is happening is things like Startcoin, things like Indiegogo, Kickstarter. That's where the innovation is being focused these days. The banks are simply pumping up asset bubbles. Now,
okay, but what about Deutsche Bank, who says that we're going to close our retail branches because we don't want to take deposits anymore because it's too costly for us to take deposits? Also, they're not making loans. The banks don't make loans, and they don't take deposits. So why would we even have these? What are these banks doing? They're just becoming a conduit to keep alive the zombie economy, effectively. But they don't even want deposits, Steve.
No. So in some ways, deposits are the cheapest liability. They've got to balance their assets and liabilities.
But they don't want them.
Some of the banks.
They don't want the deposits because the government's giving them free money. They're trying to dump them. They're trying to dump all retail deposits. They don't want retail depositors anymore.
Well, there's a strong argument that we should actually try to separate the money creation aspect of the banking sector, which we need, from the transaction side of the monetary system, which we need. And if the banks don't want to handle transactions, things like the Japanese post office bank make much more sense. Not for profit. Everybody trusts it. Nobody expects it to go bankrupt. The transactions occur.
Yeah, but the problem with Deutsche Bank, what they're saying is because in Germany, there's negative interest rates. So it costs them money to deal with anybody's deposit. They lose money on it. So they're not interested in losing money. They don't feel their customer will pay for it.
And this is why people who argue in favour of negative interest rates, this is economists again coming out thinking that'll stimulate the economy. The reality is if you make a deposit at a bank, that becomes a part of your deposit account is there, but simultaneously that becomes the reserves that they hold at the central bank. And that's where the negative interest rates are being applied. So they're saying it's actually, you're increasing the cost of us holding deposits, which is a sign of how little conventional economists know about the banking system functions, that they don't realise that's what they're doing to the banks. So it's not just the banks that are insane, it's our regulators following an insane theory that are causing a huge part of these problems.
But what about in the U.S. here, across Europe, there's been a huge collapse in investment. In the United States, all the corporations have piles of cash, but they're instead taking on debt to buy back their shares. They're not investing in any future, production.
Yeah, and this is largely because you do need a large amount of spending in an economy to be financed by creation of new money, which we've tied up with the creation of debt. This is Schumpeter's brilliant point about what banks should be doing. Banks should be funding entrepreneurs. And that's what enables investment to take place. If you don't have that creation of money, it doesn't happen. But the banks, because there's so much debt that's been accumulated through that process from 1950 right through to 2010, the corporations, even though they've got lots of cash, they're carrying a larger part of debt than they've ever done before, except at the peak of the crisis, and they're simply not interested in financing investment. And of course, their consumers can't afford to buy either. So all the conduits that normally cause us to have that innovation are gone, and yet we're not addressing the problem directly.
Okay, one of the things that I hear when you're describing all this is that there's the so-called real economy, which is on a global basis worth about 60 trillion. In the U.S. it's something like 17 trillion.
Yeah.
Here in the U.K. I think it's 2.5 trillion. Okay, that's the measurement of output or GDP, spending money, military, government, household. Behind this economy is the shadow economy, which is 10 to 20 times bigger. And what you're describing there about the fact that they put the loan on their balance sheet, which ends up on the central bank, which is charging a negative interest rate. This is all happening in the shadows in a financial world that is 10 times to 20 times bigger. That is to say, it's a 1.5 to 2.5 quadrillion dollars in size. And all of the policy, all of the energy, all of the work, all of the meetings are about managing that shadow, unseen, unscrupulous accounting fraud that's behind the scenes. Professor Keene, before the break, we were building up to a massively interesting point, which is that the shop front of the global economy, what people normally deal with buying a bologna sandwich or hiring a plumber, is a $60 trillion global economy. Behind that has, over the period of neoliberalization, of financialization, of monetization, post-Reagan, post-Thatcher, has built up this $1.5 to $2 quadrillion worth of a shadow banking system. And all the policy talk we hear, all of the interest rate talk we hear, all the central bank gab fest and all their testimony, and the Osborne and Cameron always refer to this ultimately in their speeches, is tinkering with this unseen shadow banking system about, well, do we give money to the central bank at a negative interest rate who's lending it to a central bank who's exogenously producing money out of thin air to produce an asset price which is collateralized? So wouldn't it make sense? My question is, doesn't it make sense at some point to simply say, you know what, maybe we need to get rid of this shadow banking system and either through a debt jubilee, a rejiggering of the global currency grid, say, you know what, we got to go back to Bretton Woods and figure out these currencies are all completely out of whack. Let's put them back on course. So ultimately the question is, isn't that where the problem is, in that unseen shadow world?
That's the problem. And an unseen shadow world is trying to revive that, as I always said, is like trying to revive the parasite rather than the host the parasite is killing. And it is the whole vision of the financial sector as being a way of generating efficiency and making capitalism work better, et cetera, has been wired into the brains of these politicians because they went through PPE courses at Oxford and so on and swallowed all the stuff about efficient markets and so on. They're surrounded by the finance sector. Just look over our shoulders here what the financial sector is. And they simply can't think of an economy without a huge financial sector.
Right, so the general population, when they hear politicians talk, there's a huge disconnect because they say, you know what, you're talking about inflation and deflation. I don't understand those words in the context of my day-to-day existence. You're talking about negative interest rates, which make no sense to me as I'm down the shop. So these politicians have become enslaved to that shadow banking system in a lot of ways.
They're thinking inside the brain of the parasite. They're not thinking outside and looking at the real economy and saying, hey, it's the real economy that's suffering. Let's do something direct. But that's what QE for the people is about. Do something directly to that economy, and if you do it, you'll reduce the size of the shadow. It's the shadow that's causing the pain, not the body.
Max is often